Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The rustling in the attic isn't just rats. Scary story, published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The First Night. Emily stood in the doorway of her new home, gripping the handle of her suitcase with white-knuckled determination. The house was old, with paint peeling from the walls and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. But it was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild after the wreckage of her marriage. She glanced down at Jason, her 8-year-old son, who was clutching his worn-out teddy bear. His eyes were wide with the nervous excitement that came with being in a new place. "Come on, buddy," she said, forcing a smile. "Let's check it out." The front door creaked ominously as they stepped inside. The wooden floors groaned under their feet, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture, untouched since the last occupants had abruptly left. Emily wrinkled her nose at the musty smell that hung in the air, a mixture of mildew and something she couldn't quite place. She flicked the light switch, and the dim bulbs flickered to life, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. "This is nice," she murmured, more to herself than to Jason. Jason didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the dark hallway that led to the back of the house, where the attic door was barely visible in the gloom. Emily followed his gaze, a chill running down her spine, but quickly brushed it off. It was just an old house, nothing to be afraid of. The first night was the hardest. After a long day of unpacking, Emily settled Jason into bed and retreated to her own room. Exhausted, she collapsed onto the creaky mattress, letting out a deep sigh. But sleep didn't come easily. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in on her, making her painfully aware of every sound, the tick of the old clock, the rustle of the curtains, and then something else. A faint rustling noise from above. Emily's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. It was probably just rats, she told herself, trying to steady her breathing. Old houses like this were bound to have pests. But as she lay there, listening, the rustling grew louder, more insistent, as if something was moving just above her head. She sat up, straining to hear, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. Emily shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination playing tricks on her. Yet, a lingering unease settled in her chest, a whispering doubt that she was not as alone in this house as she wanted to believe. And for the first time since they moved in, Emily felt truly isolated. The walls that should have sheltered her felt more like a cage, trapping her with something unseen, something she wasn't ready to face. Not yet. Chapter 2. Unsettling Discoveries. Emily awoke the next morning with a heavy sense of dread, the memory of the rustling noise from the attic still fresh in her mind. She tried to shake it off as she went through the motions of breakfast, but the unease lingered, clinging to her like the damp, musty smell of the house. Jason sat quietly at the table, his usual chatter replaced by an unsettling silence. He hadn't mentioned the noise, and she didn't want to bring it up. It was easier to pretend it was nothing. After Jason headed off to play in the backyard, Emily found herself drawn to the attic door. The narrow staircase leading up to it seemed steeper than she remembered, each step creaking under her weight as she ascended. She hesitated at the top, hand trembling on the doorknob. A part of her wanted to turn back, to leave whatever was up there undisturbed. But she couldn't ignore the gnawing curiosity or the fear that had taken root in her mind. The attic was a tomb of forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the weak light that filtered through a small, grimy window. Old, cobweb-covered furniture lay scattered about, draped in yellowing sheets. Boxes labeled with faded handwriting were stacked haphazardly, their contents long forgotten. Emily's eyes were drawn to a large, ornate chest in the corner, its heavy lock rusted but intact. She knelt beside it, running her fingers over the intricate carvings. Why would someone lock up a chest in the attic and leave it behind? As she stood, her gaze fell upon an old family portrait hanging crookedly on the wall. Figures were dressed in clothes from a bygone era, their faces stern and unsmiling. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she noticed that the eyes of the young girl in the portrait had been scratched out, leaving hollow, staring voids. A shiver ran down her spine. What had happened in this house? That night, the rustling returned, more insistent, as if something was trying to break through the ceiling. Emily lay in bed, every muscle tensed, her heart pounding with each movement overhead. Jason's cries shattered the silence, and she rushed to his room, finding him tangled in his sheets, his face pale with fear. "Mommy," the girl in the attic. "She's crying," Jason whimpered, his voice trembling. "She wants to come down." Emily's blood ran cold. "It's just a bad dream, honey," she whispered, pulling him into her arms. But even as she tried to soothe him, she felt the weight of the portrait's empty eyes watching her from the darkness. The next day, Emily visited Mrs. Thompson, their elderly neighbor, hoping for some answers. The old woman's house was warm and cozy, a stark contrast to Emily's own cold, shadowy home. As they sipped tea, Emily casually mentioned the noises in the attic. Mrs. Thompson's hand paused midair, her expression darkening. "That house has a history," she said quietly, her eyes distant. "There are things better left alone, my dear. Some secrets should stay buried." "What do you mean?" Emily pressed, her heart pounding. But Mrs. Thompson shook her head, her lips a thin line. "Just be careful, Emily. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed." As Emily left, Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in her mind, deepening the sense of unease that had begun to consume her. She realized that the house's past was not just a mystery. It was a living, breathing presence, one that was slowly tightening its grip around her and Jason. Chapter 3: The Strange Behavior of Jason. Emily's footsteps echoed on the creaky wooden floor as she closed the door behind her, Mrs. Thompson's warning still reverberating in her ears. The walk back to the house felt longer than usual, the weight of her neighbor's words pressing down on her. She pushed open the door, immediately struck by the silence that greeted her. Jason was nowhere in sight. "Jason," she called, her voice wavering slightly. There was no answer. She found him in the living room, crouched on the floor, a crayon clutched tightly in his small hand. He didn't look up as she entered, completely absorbed in his task. Emily approached cautiously, peering over his shoulder at the paper he was drawing on. The image was dark, and disturbing thick black lines scratched across the page, forming the twisted figure that seemed to emerge from a swirling mass. At the top of the page, in Jason's shaky handwriting, were the words, "My friend." A cold shiver crept down Emily's spine. "Jason, what are you drawing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He finally looked up at her, his blue eyes wide and innocent, but there was something off about his expression, something she couldn't quite place. "My friend in the attic," he replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Emily forced a smile, her heart pounding. "Honey, there's no one in the attic. You know that, right?" Jason didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to his drawing, humming softly to himself. Emily's stomach twisted with unease. She crouched down beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Jason, look at me," she said, her voice firmer this time. "Who is your friend?" He paused, his crayon hovering over the paper. Then, in a voice that was far too calm, he said, "She says she's been waiting for us. She wants to come out and play." Emily's blood ran cold. The rational part of her mind screamed that it was just Jason's imagination, that he was a child coping with the stress of their move and the strange new environment. But deep down, something darker gnawed at her, something she couldn't shake. That night, she found Jason sleepwalking. He was standing at the foot of the attic stairs, his small hand resting on the doorknob. His eyes were open, but they were vacant, unseeing. Emily rushed to him, scooping him up in her arms. His body was limp, and he offered no resistance as she carried him back to his room. When she laid him down, he mumbled something under his breath. She leaned in closer, her heart hammering in her chest. "She's lonely," Jason whispered, his voice distant, as though coming from a faraway place. "She wants me to stay with her." Emily recoiled, fear clawing at her insides. She hurried out of his room, closing the door behind her, as if it could keep the darkness at bay. In the quiet of her own bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. Was Jason just acting out? Or was there something more sinister at play? The line between reality and her growing fear was blurring, leaving her trapped in a terrifying uncertainty. Emily's thoughts spiraled, her rational mind warring with the rising panic that something was horribly wrong in this house and with Jason. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence, but her mind was filled with the echoes of Jason's words, his unsettling calm, and the chilling thought that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't imagining things after all. The attic was more than just a room filled with old junk. It was a place of secrets, and those secrets were beginning to unravel. Chapter 4. The History Uncovered. Emily barely slept that night, her mind racing with worry and fear. The sound of Jason's soft breathing in the next room was her only comfort, but even that was tainted by the memory of his eerie calmness. As dawn broke, bringing with it a gray, overcast sky, she resolved to uncover the truth about the house. There had to be something, some explanation for what was happening to Jason and the strange occurrences that had haunted them since they moved in. After dropping Jason off at school, Emily drove to the town's small library. The building was old and smelled faintly of dust and aging paper, but it offered a quiet sanctuary from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. She approached the librarian, a kindly woman with silver hair and a gentle smile. "I'm looking for information about my house," Emily began, trying to keep her tone casual. "It's an old place, and I'd like to know more about its history." The librarian's smile faded slightly. "Which house, dear?" "The one on Sycamore Street," Emily replied, watching as the woman's eyes widened in recognition. The librarian hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Ah, the Rutherford place. It has a bit of a dark past, I'm afraid. Follow me." She led Emily to a section of old town records and newspapers, pulling out a few volumes that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. As Emily flipped through the brittle pages, her heart began to pound. The Rutherfords, a once prominent family in the town, had lived in the house for generations. But their story took a tragic turn nearly a century ago. Sarah Rutherford, their youngest daughter, had vanished without a trace. The last anyone had seen of her was on a stormy night when she was playing in the attic. Her disappearance had shaken the town, and despite exhaustive searches, she was never found. The family, grief-stricken and haunted by whispers of foul play, left the house shortly after, never to return. The portrait Emily had found in the attic was indeed of the Rutherfords, and Sarah's eyes had been scratched out as if someone had tried to erase her from the family's memory. Emily's hands trembled as she read the accounts. Parallels between Sarah's story and Jason's behavior were too strong to ignore. The friend in the attic was it Sarah? The idea sent a chill through her, the pieces of a horrific puzzle clicking into place. History was repeating itself, and her son was caught in the middle of it. Back at the house, the atmosphere felt heavier, more oppressive. The rustling in the attic had become more frequent, a constant, maddening sound that seemed to be clawing at Emily's sanity. She could hear whispers now, too soft, insistent, like a distant voice trying to break through the walls. They filled the silence, making her jump at every creak and groan of the old house. Emily stood in front of the attic door, her heart hammering in her chest. She pressed her ear against the wood, holding her breath. The rustling stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint, childlike whisper that sent ice through her veins. "Come play." She stumbled back, her pulse racing. There was no more denying it. The house was haunted, and whatever was in the attic wasn't going to leave them alone. Emily's mind swirled with fear and determination. She had to protect Jason, but how could she fight something she couldn't see, something that had already claimed one child? As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the house into shadows, Emily knew she was running out of time. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, echoing through the halls, and she realized with a sinking heart that she was no longer just a mother trying to keep her son safe. She was the last line of defense against a darkness that had been waiting far too long. Chapter 5. Confronting the Attic. The house was shrouded in darkness as Emily stood at the foot of the attic stairs, the setting sun casting long, haunting shadows across the walls. The whispers had become a constant, sinister presence, weaving through the quiet spaces of the house like a malignant thread. Emily's hands trembled as she gripped the flashlight, its beam cutting through the murky gloom. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. This was it. She had to confront whatever was tormenting her son, no matter how terrifying the truth might be. The stairs groaned under her weight as she ascended slowly, each step amplifying the thudding of her heart. The beam of her flashlight quivered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The rustling noise had stopped, but the silence was more terrifying than the sound. Emily reached the top, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She hesitated for a moment, the darkness beyond the attic door seeming to pulse with a life of its own. With a final surge of courage, she pushed open the door. The beam of her flashlight cut through the thick, stagnant air, illuminating the dusty, cluttered space. Her gaze was immediately drawn to the large, ornate chest in the corner. It was open, its lid propped up at an odd angle. The sight of the chest, once locked tight, sent a jolt of fear through her. Contents: old toys, a faded rag doll, and a diary lay scattered across the floor. Emily's flashlight flickered, the shadows around her growing darker and more oppressive. She knelt beside the chest, her fingers brushing over the diary. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. Her breath hitched as she opened it, revealing neat, childlike handwriting. The diary belonged to Sarah Rutherford, and the entries spoke of a happy life turned sorrowful, culminating in vague references to something frightening in the attic. The last entry was scrawled hastily, the ink smudged. "She's here. She won't let me leave." A cold sweat broke out on Emily's brow. The rustling noise started again, louder this time, mingling with the faint sound of whispers. Her flashlight wavered as she tried to focus on the darkness around her. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, flickering and shifting as if it were alive. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the sound echoing in her ears like a drumbeat. The shadows seemed to close in, growing darker and more menacing. Emily could barely make out a shape vague and indistinct, yet undeniably there. The fear gripped her like a vise, tightening around her throat. She fought the urge to scream, her throat dry, her limbs feeling heavy and unresponsive. Her mind raced with images of Jason, her love for him mingling with the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. The thought of losing him drove her forward, even as the darkness pressed in. She grabbed the diary, clutching it to her chest, and slowly backed away, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The shadow seemed to follow her, its presence a constant, suffocating pressure. Emily stumbled down the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She slammed the attic door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to calm her racing heart. The rustling had stopped, but the whispers remained, a haunting reminder of the horror she had barely escaped. As she stood there, trembling, clutching the diary, Emily knew one thing for certain. The house was far more than a mere relic of the past. It was a living nightmare, and whatever had taken Sarah Rutherford was now reaching out for her son. She had faced the darkness, but the true terror was only just beginning. Chapter 6. The haunting escalates. The atmosphere in the house was stifling, each corner steeped in a growing sense of dread. The whispers had grown more insistent, as if the walls themselves were conspiring against Emily. "Emily, come here," the voices called, their tones laced with malice and sorrow. At night, the house seemed to come alive, its creaks and groans a sinister symphony that refused to let her sleep. Objects shifted on their own, doors slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows, and every shadow seemed to writhe with malevolent intent. Emily's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. She clutched the diary tightly, the old pages revealing Sarah Rutherford's lonely existence and her desperate longing for a friend. The final, jagged entry, the one that had been hastily scrawled, left Emily with a bone-deep fear. Sarah had been waiting for someone to keep her company, and the diary's abrupt end hinted at a fate too terrible to contemplate. Jason's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He spoke of Sarah as though she were a living person, his friend who had promised to come and take him away. The little boy's once cheerful demeanor had darkened, replaced by a pallor and a glazed look in his eyes that made Emily's heart ache with worry. His sleepwalking had grown more dangerous. One night, she found him standing at the top of the stairs, his tiny body teetering dangerously close to the edge. She grabbed him, her pulse racing as she pulled him back to safety. "Sarah's coming for me," Jason muttered sleepily, his voice devoid of emotion. "She says I have to go with her." Emily's desperation was a gnawing, relentless force. She felt trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Every day, the house seemed to tighten its grip, making it impossible for her to leave. She had tried to contact a realtor, hoping to get out before things got worse, but her calls were met with a constant busy signal or unanswered messages. It was as if the house itself was ensuring they stayed trapped within its walls. The tension between mother and son reached a breaking point. Emily's fear for Jason's safety clashed with her mounting frustration. "Jason, you have to listen to me," she pleaded one night, her voice rising with panic. "Sarah isn't real. She's just a story." But Jason only looked at her with eyes that were distant and sad. "She's real to me," he whispered, clutching his blanket tightly. Emily's mind raced, trying to connect the fragments of Sarah's story with her own reality. The diary had painted a picture of a child who was left alone, abandoned and desperate for a friend. Jason's connection to Sarah seemed more than just coincidental. It was a chilling parallel to the loneliness and desperation that had consumed Sarah's final days. As the whispers grew louder, more insistent, Emily knew she was running out of time. The house was relentless, its dark presence encroaching upon every corner of their lives. She had to find a way to break free from its grip, to save Jason from the clutches of a ghostly past that refused to stay buried. Each day was a battle against the encroaching darkness, and Emily feared that if she didn't act soon, she would lose her son to the shadows forever. Chapter 7. The Climax. The house roared with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundation. Emily's heart pounded against her ribs as she grabbed Jason's hand, trying the front door one last time. It wouldn't budge. The rustling noise from the attic had transformed into a deafening cacophony, a relentless, angry wave that seemed to echo through every room. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to get Jason out, but the house was fighting back with everything it had. "Come on, Jason," Emily urged, her voice tight with desperation. She turned to the attic, where the noise was most intense. The whispers had become a frantic chorus, the shadows in the corners of the rooms twisting and writhing as if alive. Every door she tried was locked, each handle cold and unyielding. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, mocking her futile attempts to escape. With a final burst of determination, Emily pulled Jason up the stairs toward the attic. The weight of their situation pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she could see no other way. If she didn't confront whatever was causing this, she would lose her son to the shadows. Her flashlight flickered erratically, casting jittery beams of light across the attic's cluttered expanse. At the top of the stairs, the atmosphere was stifling. The attic seemed to pulsate with an almost tangible sense of dread. Emily's flashlight caught the glint of something in the darkness. The shadowy figure she had glimpsed before now loomed large, its form barely visible, but unmistakably there. The figure was a spectral child, twisted and gaunt, her eyes hollow sockets of despair. It was Sarah Rutherford, but the years of isolation and torment had turned her into a harbinger of fear. Sarah's ghost hovered near the chest, her form flickering with an eerie light. "She wants me to stay," Jason whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and longing. "She says I can be her friend forever." Emily's heart ached. She knew she had to confront Sarah, to free her spirit and save her son. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, she stepped forward, holding the diary high. The ghostly figure of Sarah turned towards her, a mournful wail echoing through the attic. "Sarah!" Emily cried out, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm here to help you. I know you're lonely, but this isn't the way. You need to find peace." Sarah's shadowy form wavered, a flicker of something like recognition passing through her hollow eyes. Emily opened the diary, reading aloud the last entry, the words filled with the sorrow and longing Sarah had felt in her final moments. "You were loved, Sarah. Your family wanted to help you, but they couldn't find you. Don't let your pain trap others." The air grew colder as Sarah's form shuddered, the oppressive weight of her despair beginning to lift. Emily's voice, steady and filled with empathy, reached out to the ghost. "You can find peace. Let go of your pain. It's time to move on." Sarah's form seemed to dissolve into a soft, mournful glow, her wail turning into a whisper. The noise in the attic diminished, the rustling fading into silence. The atmosphere lightened, and Emily felt a strange calm settle over her. She glanced at Jason, who looked up at her with wide, relieved eyes. Emily took a deep breath, knowing the battle was over. The house was quiet now, the oppressive darkness lifting. She had faced the horror, and, through her love for Jason and her compassion for Sarah, had brought an end to the torment. Together, they would leave the house behind, stepping out into the light of a new beginning, free from the shadows of the past. Chapter 8: The Aftermath. The morning sun filtered through the attic window, casting a gentle light over the room that had once been shrouded in darkness. Emily and Jason stood together, the weight of the past few days lifting as they looked around the now quiet house. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted them was gone, replaced by an unusual sense of calm. It was as though the house had exhaled a long-held breath. Emily packed the last of their belongings into the car, her movements mechanical, but her heart lightened by the sense of relief. Jason helped, his small hands carrying boxes with a newfound energy. The house, once a prison of terror, now felt like a weight lifted from their lives. Emily could scarcely believe they were finally leaving. It had been an ordeal that tested their strength and resilience, but they had emerged from it, albeit forever changed. As they drove away, Emily glanced back at the house, its dark silhouette fading in the distance. She felt a twinge of uncertainty. Had they truly rid the place of its haunting, or was it simply waiting in the shadows for a new victim? The ghost of Sarah Rutherford was gone, but the house had been a vessel of so much pain and sorrow. She couldn't shake the feeling that, while they had escaped, the darkness had not been entirely vanquished. The journey to their new home was quiet. Jason sat in the back seat, his head resting against the window, his eyes closed. Emily's thoughts churned with the remnants of the terror they had endured. The house had been more than just a place of supernatural dread. It had been a mirror of their own fears and struggles. As they neared their new house, Emily tried to focus on the promise of a fresh start, but her anxiety lingered. Upon arrival, they unpacked and settled in. The new house, while less imposing, had an air of normalcy that felt almost too good to be true. Emily tried to convince herself that they had left the past behind. But as they sat down for the night, the sense of unease remained. Jason was quiet at bedtime, his earlier excitement replaced by a contemplative silence. As Emily tucked him in, he looked up at her with wide, solemn eyes. "Mom, do you think Sarah will find us here?" he asked softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "No, sweetheart," she replied, trying to sound reassuring. "Sarah is gone. We're safe now." Jason nodded, but a few moments later, Emily heard a faint rustling sound coming from somewhere in the house. Her blood ran cold, and she turned to Jason, who was already looking toward the darkened hallway. "Mom," Jason's voice trembled, "I think I hear something." Emily's heart pounded as she strained to listen. The sound was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The rustling continued, a haunting reminder that their past had not entirely let go. She swallowed hard, trying to calm her racing thoughts. They had faced one horror, but the shadows of their old fears seemed to have followed them, lurking just beyond the light. As Emily pulled the blanket tightly around Jason, she resolved to keep vigilant. The rustling might have been nothing, or it could be the start of another chapter in their story. For now, all she could do was hope that the nightmares were finally over, and that, despite the lingering unease, their new home would offer the peace they so desperately sought.